So this is a shear on Bava, but it's a very specific shear. This shear will be different than basically any shear that you will hear on Mishnayos, because I'm trying to teach you by using the Mishnah a certain methodology, which is a critical methodology, and so on. And once you begin to think in terms of this methodology, you'll have an ability to understand to some extent the inner workings of the Mishnah. Now, the methodology has certain skills associated with it. You'll learn these skills as we go through the Mishnahs, and we'll do it. And then we will recapitulate the Mishnah, we'll re-summarize the Mishnah, and talk about the methodology itself. What can we learn? We will do two things, really. We will learn the Mishnah and try to learn the Mishnah in a much deeper way. And then what we'll discuss is the skills that I've been using to understand the Mishnah. So we'll first learn the Mishnah, and then we'll begin to observe exactly the skills which were necessary to derive so that you can understand the Mishnah. And in this combination, we hope, Mitzvah Hashem, that eventually you'll be able to partake of the skills. Now, the first Mishnah in Bava Kama, it starts off like this. It attempts to define in some way a mazik, what a mazik is. And this is a very important skill itself, the concept of definition. What a definition does, it attempts to tell you exactly the qualities that a thing possesses, which indicate its essence. So in order to describe a thing, you have to describe what's called the essential principles. Now, every entity has an essence, and the essence is exactly the core elements of its essence, of its definition. It also has other elements, and these elements are called properties. It has both essential properties, which are part of its essence, and what you have to know, and also what's called non-essential qualities. Now, these are qualities which also belong to the thing, but they're not part of the essence of it. So you don't really need these characteristics to understand what a thing is. A definition answers the question, what is this thing? Very few people understand information by understanding the essence of things. What they do is they describe it. There's a difference between a description and a definition. A description describes all the different properties or qualities of a thing. The definition of a thing describes only those qualities which are part of telling us what is this thing. That's the question. What is this question? What is this thing itself? And this concept is called a definition, or in Hebrew, mahus. The word mahus is a medieval Jewish word. It doesn't occur in the Bible and the Torah. It doesn't occur in the Mishnah. It was created at the time in the medieval times itself, and the word mahus comes from the word mahu. What is this? So therefore, the word mahus together now applies to the essence. And wherever possible, what you have to do is try and get a definition of what is this thing, and that's called its essence. So we're going to learn the first Mishnah of Bava Kama to begin to do this. Avos Nazikin. What it's telling us is a very important concept. There are 4 general categories of a mazik. What does that mean? Well, basically it's saying it's going to tell you all the possibilities of what is a damager and so on. And it's talking about a damager. But what is it going to tell me what these 4 things are? Well, they're called avos. And the word of implies a teaching principle, something which from its example tells me everything else. So an of is a general principle that illustrates an entire category. And the word tolda indicates a detail of that category. That's a technical definition. The Torah in many cases teaches us by the concept of and tolda. It teaches us a general example of the category. And then it teaches us which are called overs. And then from that general category, it teaches us the derivative categories, which called are the details of that. And these details are called toldas. So that's the way the Torah is telling us, I'm going to teach you about mazik. I'm going to tell you general categories, and then I'll explain to you some of the details that apply to the general category. So when the Mishnah says Abba v'Zikin, it's talking about there are four general categories that fundamentally encompass every type of damager. That's right. It encompasses all types of damages. Now, there are many possible types of damages, and there are many ways that you can damage something. So we have to see exactly how these categories are able to capture all these things. So what does it say? There are four categories, okay? It says Hashor, the ox. Well, we understand what an ox is. We understand in a certain sense how it can damage you. How does an ox damage you? Well, it can damage you by what? By goring you with its horns. So that's called negicha, goring. It can damage you by eating. It can go into your field and eat up your crops. So therefore, it also has a possibility to damage you in a somewhat different way. The Mishnah does not distinguish so much between the way an ox damages, just the fact that it is an agent which can damage you. The next category, it says, Hashor ve'abor. A ball can damage you. What does that mean, a ball? A ball is a pit or some kind of obstacle placed in your path, and you're walking, and what happens? You trip over the object, or it's a hole in the ground, and you trip on the hole in the ground. So that's the concept of a ball. That's a second category. A third category, Hashor ve'abor ve'amava, is maver. There's a discussion in the Gemara, what does maver really mean? And we'll take one of these points. The word maver is translated as an eating, that you eat something. So therefore, maver is somewhat different. A shor talks about the actual mazik, the damager. The ball talks about an actual thing which damage. It's an entity of possible damage. But maver is not an entity of possible damage. Maver is a certain type of damage. In other words, you can damage something by breaking it, or you can damage something by eating it. So in other words, if you have an animal that goes into your field and starts to eat the crops and so on and so forth, it's doing its damage through the process of eating. Eating is a type of damage. It's not an entity which does damage. That's a shore, or that's a ball. It's mav is a type of damage. So it seems to deviate from the general concept and so on. Now, what it says about this in this way, it says there are the fourth category is vahever. What is hever? Well, hever comes from the word be'iva. It comes from the word bo'ar, from a flame. Hever is really fire. That what happens is you start a fire, and then you walk away from the fire, and the fire spreads. For example, a wind comes down and suddenly fans the flames so that suddenly the fire, the sparks, go out from the source and go on something else. So let's say you start a fire where you are, and that fire spreads in such a way where suddenly the flames go on your suit or on a person's suit. and suddenly it starts to burn the person's suit. So therefore, it's talking about another entity of damage called a fire. So these are the four: shor, ox; bor, a pit; a maver, eating; and finally hever, fire. These are the four general categories. Why did the Torah choose these as general categories? Well, we'll see up ahead. But these are the four categories that the Torah speaks that are general enough to include all the concepts of damage. Now let's see how it does that. So the question is something about the Torah, which is very important. The Torah cannot obviously talk about every type of damage that there is in certain ways. It cannot talk about every type of detail possible in the world. So what it talks about is specific general categories that include all the categories of damage. But many times, in order to teach you the general concept of what is chayav, what is obligated by the damage, the Torah itself then begins to enumerate the general categories. So what the Mishnah is going to tell us is that the Torah has to enumerate all four of these categories: shor, bor, mava, and hever. And from these four categories, general categories, we can understand and learn out all the details. Now, how is that done? Why can't I just have one category? Why can't I say anything which damages your chayav? It's fundamentally you are responsible for the damage that's incurred by any type of damaging agent. No, the Torah says only damages, entity which damage, that do so in a specific way are chayav. So therefore, the Torah is not here to tell you just because something has the potential to damage that you would be obligated to pay. In other words, it only says there are certain types of damages which have to be done, and then you will be obligated to pay. So we see that damage is a general concept. It's suddenly you do something, or something you possess does something that is responsible for damage. But the Torah says that not every damage are you obligated to pay. So is the Torah really there to tell you what damage is? No. It's there to tell you when you are obligated, when you are chayav, tashlumim, or to pay for the damage. The Torah is not giving us a lecture on a damager. There are many things which can damage that sometimes you don't have to pay at all. So therefore the Torah says, I don't have to teach you about these things. I only have to teach you about those things which damage and you are obligated to pay. And that's it. So that's what the Torah is saying is, and it's what the Mishnah is saying is exactly. It says, Lo hare a shor, an ox, which damages, kare amava is like when an animal eats. These are two different forms of damage. And if I had written one form of damage, let's say the shor, let's say, I would not have known that eating something, an animal which you have, and it suddenly goes into another person's fields and it starts eating. That does not mean from shor that I would automatically understand that eating is obligated. Because like I say, there are two concepts in damage. One, the concept of damage, period, that something is ruined or destroyed. The second concept is if you are obligated, because in some way you are considered the cause of that. So we see that the two concepts of damage, and what the Mishnah is saying over here, that a shor is obligated. And if the Torah had written that if a shor damages something, you have to pay, that automatically means that eating. So that's not true. The Torah says you would not know that eating was also a damage and you'd be obligated to pay. Why? It doesn't say. It just says, Lo hare ashor kare mava. A shor damages in a different way than mava, which is eating. And that difference would make each one an individual. So if I only wrote that a shor is chayev, you damage it, it would automatically include a maver. No, it says not. That depending on what the example is of what's considered a damager, that example is highly specific. So if the Torah had written shor, you would not know maver. That's what it says. So therefore, the Torah has to write maver. The Mishnah goes further on and saying, not only that, v'lo hamaver tareh shor. And if the Torah had written maver, that eating is an example of damage, you could not generalize and say, so therefore, the shor who damages also, like if the shor gores you, if he gores you, if the Torah had written that a shor obligates you to pay. Why? Because it gored. Would you know that if a shor eats, it also obligates you? No, you wouldn't know it because it's a totally different type of damage. So the Mishnah says a simple thing, that even if you include one type of damager as as a teaching principle, you would not necessarily know other types of teaching principles. So each principle has to be mentioned in the Torah by itself. You see, that's a very important principle in the concept of Torah, how the Torah teaches us the laws of damages. It teaches us the laws of damages by mentioning all the different types of general categories that obligate a person. And if the Mishnah does not mention these categories, you're not obligated. So therefore, what the Torah writes as an example to teach you is very specific. So it says, so therefore, if the Torah had written shor or the Torah had written mava, eating, you would have to have both of these stipulated in the Torah to understand that both types of damage obligate you. The Mishnah goes on, not a shor as an example and mava as an example, they would not obligate a fire. What does that mean? If I had written in the Torah, if God had written in the Torah that if you're obligated to the damage of a shor or maver, does that mean I don't automatically understand that you'd also be obligated if a fire? So the Mishnah says no. So in other words, each damager is highly specific and has to in some way be mentioned by the Torah to know it. And if the Torah does not mention it, you would think that the person is pater, he is completely exempt from payment. So in a certain way, the Mishnah is describing how you actually learn out the categories of damage which are obligate the person. Why is that? Why would I say that something an entity which eats or an entity which gores? Why would I think that only they are chayav and what a fire does not cause real damage? Why is that? Because you would say like this: a shor is alive; it has what's called ruach chayim, and also a mava, something that eats, is also alive. So if I use both of these as examples of what you're chayav, I would say, well, it's something which is alive. But let's say a fire, like Aish, which is not alive, I would say, well, a person doesn't have control over Aish. It doesn't have a control over the fire, so you can't really watch it. You see, the Torah only considers a person liable for damage if in some way he could have prevented the damage. In other words, he has to watch it. He has to watch that entity which damages. And if he controls it, he has the ability to control that entity so that it doesn't do damage. In that case, when he doesn't control it, he is obligated because he should have controlled it. So fundamental, the principle which makes you connected to a mazik, which obligates you for the damage, is only if you can watch something. That's called shmira. So the Torah says, if I had written a shor, which is alive, and a maver, which is alive, I would only think that which is alive you can watch. But that which is not alive, like a fire, You can't watch it. It's not in your control. So therefore, I would think that you would not be obligated. So it says that's not true. So therefore, the Mishnah has to write that also a fire is an entity which damages. So now the Torah is telling us an interesting concept that any specific item that you mention is obligated to damage is highly specific to that entity. And if you want to include other items, you would actually include other items which are also included in that entity. So therefore, you would have to write H, that if you light a fire and that fire escapes, goes out and burns something, you are obligated to pay for the damage. Why? Because you wrote Aish. If you didn't write Aish, you only wrote Shor and Maver, you would never be able to say Aish is Chayav. So therefore, it has to mention two things. There are two categories. There's a category of a living thing, either as a shore, a goring, or eating. But now you have to mention another thing. You have to mention the category of even something which is not living. So if you started a fire and the fire expanded, it went out on its own, and like the wind suddenly attached itself to the fire, and it blew the fire above beyond its boundaries, the Mishnah is saying, the Torah mentioned that, so therefore I have to include that. Now, what about a pit? The Torah said that a pit sometimes can fire. So it says, in the case of what? Of all three of these, shor, maver, and fire. If I knew all these three categories mentioned in the Torah, that they all are chayav, would I know that if a person falls into a pit that you made in the public, let's say you dig up the ground and you make a pit. Let's say you do that in the public space, and somebody falls into the pit, or somebody trips on the pit and breaks his leg. Are you obligated to pay? So that what the Mishnah is saying, if you don't include the concept of a bore, of a pit, you cannot assume that it's obligated. Why? Because the other three, the first three, the shor, the maver, and the fire, all they go to the nizik. That's right. In other words, the concept of to move, the moving thing which causes these three things to move, a shor, an ox, a maver, another ox who goes to eat, and let's say, what do you call it, also an aish. All of these things, they go from the mazik to the nizik, because every mazik damages a nizik. The mazik is the one who damages, the nizik is the one who is damaged. But a bore, a pit, doesn't move. So how does the person who's damaged get to the bore? The answer is he walks over to the bore. In other words, the bore doesn't come to him because it can't move. It's a pit. He walks over to it. So that's when he falls in. So the Mishnah says, if you don't include the concept of bore, I would say that a bore is potter. Why? Because you can't control the nizik. Because in this case, you can't watch the bore. You have to watch the nizik so that the person doesn't go into the pit himself. But you can't be held responsible for the motion of a nizik. So therefore, if I had written these other three, I would never know that a bore is chayav. So therefore, in order to tell me the concept of all these things, in order to tell me the concept of damages, you have to mention all four of them. So suddenly I realize that all four of them are examples of a mazik. That's a mazik who's alive. That's a mazik who's alive in goring, and mazik who's alive in eating. Aish is not alive, but it still can move, and you can watch it from moving. You are chayav. It's still considered damages that you did, because you are capable of watching it. And finally, A bore, which is a pit, is also considered a damager, even though you are not responsible for the motion of the pit. So that's what it says. It says, Shein a bore does not move. And since it doesn't move, how could I watch the person who falls in it? It's his problem, not mine. So the Mishnah says, so therefore, you have to mention all four of these examples. Hatzara Shavashabam, the common denominator about all these four is Shedaukan Lahazik. All of them have the ability to do damage. And because they all have the ability to do damage, and in a certain sense, you have the ability to watch all four of these, and you have to watch it so that it doesn't cause any damage. It says, therefore, it has the fundamental principle which makes them chayav. Ushmivoson olacha. So you have to watch all of these four, and you are capable of watching them. So it says, these four you have to watch. Ushmivoson olacha. The concept of guarding it or watching it applies to all four, and that links you to what a mazik is. Uchashehizik, and when it does damage, chov hamazik l'shalom. If it should do a damage, any one of these four would damage someone, then you are obligated, chov hamazik l'shalom. You are obligated to pay the amount of the damage. Tashlume nezik, a full amount, the meitav oretz, with the best of your land. And we'll explain that in a minute. So that's it. So the Mishnah is describing to you the four types of damages and why you need each of these four to be mentioned in the Torah. Because you would think if you only mentioned one, you would know the other. Or you mentioned two or three or four. You have to mention all four of these and explain that all of these four have the possibility to watch, and therefore they are your responsibility, and so on. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Why do I say there's a special method? Now, what would I do? It's how do I apply a method to what? I've just explained to you the essential concept of the Mishnah. But what am I talking about, a certain method? And I said something last time, I don't know if you listened or not, a very important concept. All ideas are interconnected and they're all related to each other. In other words, when you read something, you think you are reading a group of details and that each detail is true on its own. But that's not really true. Because if you look at all the details of a certain system, all these details are in a system. And in that system, all details have a relationship with each other. And what's that relationship? That relationship is a picture. In other words, when you look at all details in a situation, for example, in a jigsaw puzzle, where you have 1,000 pieces, all these pieces are details, and all of these pieces are true. But what's the real truth? The real truth of a jigsaw puzzle is that all the details come together and form a picture. Now, can you see what the picture will be when all of these details come together in the system? No. In other words, you only have a view of details. You study each detail alone. If I ask you, well, what's the picture that the details make? You have no idea. And if I didn't put the picture on the box, which every jigsaw puzzle has, every time you have a jigsaw puzzle, you will also see the final details that result in the combination of all the details. If I don't put the picture on the box and show you that picture, you would never know it. And then if I asked you, well, what's the picture that causes the arrangement of all these details to a single system? And I said, can you put together? You wouldn't be able to do it. In other words, if I only gave you the details and I didn't give you the final picture, you would probably have no idea had to put the details together and form a system. And this is called structural analysis. That's what it's called. It's the ability to see the total picture of all these details as they come together. And the method skill which is necessary to do that is called structural analysis. The analysis not of the details of the system, but the actual picture which results, which is a combination of all the details so that you see the soul and of the entire picture together. This is a separate skill. So in other words, you can have a genius with a photographic memory. That's right. That's a pretty good guy. Not many people have photographic memories. They remember every detail perfectly. So there are people who have photographic memories that remember every question and answer in Shas. So you know what you say to that guy? Wow. They say like Moshe Feinstein had a photographic memory. What does that mean? That Moshe Feinstein learned all of Shas, every question and answer in all of Shas. But suddenly, if you ask the person who had a photographic memory, what's the picture? What's the picture of Nezikin? What's the picture of Kachum? What's the picture of what? Of Taurus, or Zroyim, or Nashim or Nezikin? In other words, you're not asking for details, you ask him, what is the final picture? He would look at you and says, I really don't know. I can tell you all the details. I can describe to you exactly what each thing is saying. But if you ask me, what does it all amount to? What's the unity of all the pieces so that suddenly you see the picture of the essence of the whole system? I haven't the slightest idea. And unfortunately, this is even true of a person with a photographic memory. In other words, he has a memory which is like a camera, and he can record in his mind every detail. But he has no idea what happens when all these details get together and suddenly there's a picture. He doesn't know what you're talking about. And that's a serious problem. Because anything that you want to know in 2 steps. What are all the details? And then you want to be able to put together all these details into one system. And that is the picture of everything. So the method that I want to teach you is how to do that. How do you put together a lot of details to see the whole system? And what does it mean to see the whole system? What does it mean? Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of that. Now I'll give you an example of exactly how to do that and what that looks like. You see from the various different elements in the Mishnah that the Mishnah is describing certain details. What's the picture? Well, let's look at the details. You say the shor and the mava, 2 examples of a damager. And then it says, but there are certain types of damages which have the quality of being alive. And there are certain kinds of quality of the damages which are not living. They are inanimate. So it's talking about a principle called life. Life is in a very important consideration in terms of if you are able to watch it. Okay, that's one detail. Now we look at another. Another detail is not simply whether it's alive or not, but another detail about who goes to who. Because when you have a damage, you have 3 things in its structure. The first thing you notice, you say to yourself, what is the general structure of a damager? Well, in the system of damaging, you have 3 ideas. Each idea is a piece, and the 3 ideas together form a picture. The first picture that you can see from the Zikin, from Bava Kama. And what do I mean? Well, you say, well, what is this Mishnah talking about? It's talking about a damager. No, it's not talking about a damager. It's talking about damage. Well, there are three components of damage. What are they? The damager, the one who does the damage, the type of damage that he does, that's called a hezek. The damage is called a mazik. That's the first component of a damage. The second component of a damage is what? Is the nizik, the one who's damaged. So in every system of damage, you have the damager and the damagee. And finally, there's a third important element in damage, the type of damage. So that means what? That the type of damage is critical. It comes from the damager who damages the damagee, and so on. But you notice something else. The Mishnah also says something about Ruach Chaim, if it's alive, or who has to come to who. Well, why? What is that about? Where does that fit? So what you fundamentally have, we have three details that are really components of a system. So when you put the system together, you have three details. You have the damager, you have the damagee, and you have the type of damage that's done. But when you put it together, you see that there's something else in a damager, that every damager can only damage if it has a system of motility. In other words, it has a system of transportation. That's right. What? How is transportation a part of a system called a damage? Because the damager has to be transported to the damagee. And when you transport one to the other, you have to unite the damager to the damagee, the one who gets hurt. And when you unite the two, you suddenly have a possibility of damage. And what unites them? Well, some kind of movement. So the question is, what moves ashore? And the answer is life. He's alive. So therefore, he can move on his own. Okay. So therefore, you understand that the mode of transportation between the damager and the damagee occurs in a living thing by his life. The fact that he's alive means that he can move. But there's certain things that damage that are not alive, like a fire. So what moves a fire from one thing to another? What makes a fire expand to eventually reach a damagee? Well, the wind. But is the wind part of the physical aspect of the damager? No. So here you have a strange form of a damager. Normally you have a damager which possesses life. So its ability to move is within the life cycle of the damager. A shore is alive, so therefore it can move on its own. What does that mean? Well, that means it's very easy to watch because all the elements of the damager is in front of you. You can see it. It's alive. It moves on its own. So when you see the shore, you can see suddenly when it moves. So it's very easy to watch something like that. The shmirah of a damager that possesses life is very easy to watch because all of its components are contained in the one thing that it is. But this is not true of fire. Fire, its ability to move and transport, is not contained in it at all. A fire has no wind to it normally. It's only when the wind blows that it suddenly contacts the fire and then it moves the fire. And when the fire moves, it damages something. So with a fire, it's a very different thing because a fire does not have a critical element which is necessary for a damager to be watched. The wind is not part of the fire. So therefore, I would think that only something which is alive, which can be watched, because it has the two elements of the physical damage and the fact that it moves, is in the damager itself. And that's easy to watch. But if it's not in the damager, it's separate and it's unpredictable. I mean, you don't know when you start a fire and it's not moving, you don't know if suddenly a wind is going to appear and suddenly move it. So you could say, well, how can I watch the wind? Because that's a necessary element to have it done. And the answer is the Torah says, well, I'm sorry, but you got to watch the wind. In other words, when you make a fire, you have to be aware of the wind, the direction of the wind, so that that wind doesn't come and start the fire, expand the fire, and cause it to burn other things. So you are responsible for a fire, even though one critical element for it to move, it doesn't exist in it. And that's a very big chiddush, that the Torah says you're responsible for a damage caused by a fire, even though it moves not because of something you did or not because of something itself. You see, that's a very innocent concept. So the concept of life as part of a damager is a critical concept. I would think that only something which is alive can be watched. Something which is not alive and moves not on its own, but moves by something outside of it cannot be watched. And the Torah says that's not true. So therefore we see that a damager is only obligated not only when it's alive, when it's not alive also. But there's another factor that has to do with the structure of damager, damagee, and type of damage. This factor is called what is called the movement of it. And that's what we're saying. The Torah is telling you that any way the thing moves, whether it moves on its own or it moves because of something else, you're responsible for. But wait a minute, there's one more quality that indicates that you can't watch it. What? Well, you can't watch a ball. When you make a pit in the public and you create a pit, you can't watch that. Why? Because where does the motion of that damage occur? Where is the motion? Well, the motion, the thing which moves the damager, is not in the thing and doesn't come from something outside of it. But what? It comes from the worst thing of all. It comes from the person who's damaged. It comes from the damagee. So how could you watch the damagee so he doesn't get hurt? How can, unless you stand by the pit all day long, you can't know if somebody's going to fall in. So why does the Torah hold you responsible if somebody walks into your pit? Well, the Torah says very simple, because you have to watch. Not you don't prevent someone from walking into it directly, but you can prevent it because you have to cover the pit. In other words, the Torah says that you can control when the motion is part of the damagee, so that it forces the damagee to go to the damager, like a pit. And that's what the Torah says. You're still chayav because you should have covered the pit. And since you didn't cover the pit, you allowed that element called the mobility or the movement of it to be controlled by the damagee. But you're still chayav. Why? Because you didn't cover it. So you made it possible that suddenly he would fall into the pit when he walks over it. You see, so therefore fundamentally you see the structure, the complete picture of the process of damage. And what is that? Well, look at the elements. It has 4 elements. There are 4 components to the damage process. What? Well, 1, the damager, the thing which by its physical aspect, it will damage something. 2, the damagee, that we're talking about a process of damage where suddenly you became responsible for it. 3, the motility of it. The motility can vary. Either can be part of the damager, because the damager is alive, or it's a wind outside of the damager. But you're still responsible because you have to watch the wind. That's right. You have to watch the wind. And finally, even if it's not part of the damager and it's outside of him, you still are obligated, even when the damagee walks into the pit. So the Torah is talking about 4 elements that are part of the picture of what's called Nazikin. You see, even though the Mishnah is talking about specifically one element, the damager, what kind of damages are you fundamentally responsible for? Okay, but the Torah is telling you there are 4 elements to the process of damage. Damage is a process, a complete process. It's a picture which has 4 actors. That's right. It's a picture with 4 pieces or 4 actors. There's the damager, there's the damagee, there's the process of moving. What moves the damager to the damagee, you see, fundamentally. And there's the type of damages done. There are different ways to damage something. You can either break it, you can put a hole through it, or you can steal or something. There are different ways to damage something. And this is the 4th element, the way that it's damaged. All 4 of these elements are part of the picture called hezek. So the process of hezek is the main thing you're looking at. You're not looking at any one specific factor. You're looking at all 4 factors. And depending on what factor there is, the Torah will tell you, well, are you responsible or not? And it seems to be that by mentioning all 4 of these things, the Torah is saying you're responsible for all 4 types. You're responsible for live damages. You're responsible for inanimate damages, like a fire. Well, how could you watch a fire since the wind is not in it, so you can't watch the wind? No, the Torah says you have to watch the wind, even though it's outside of the fire. And finally, when the motive for movement is part of the nizik, in other words, the damagee is the one who actually has the motion. He walks into the ball. Your ball cannot walk, and your ball cannot move to him. He has to move to the ball. So that tells you the 4th element. So we see that Nazikin, the Mr. Bava Kama, talks about not what a damager, not the kinds of damages that damage. It also does not talk about the damagee, who the person who's damaged. It also doesn't talk about the method of movement specifically, nor does it talk about how, but it's saying that all 4 of these elements together constitute the structure of hezek. And therefore, what you are learning is not the details of any specific item. You are speaking about the details of the system, the picture as a whole. And you are speaking about the kind of thing that obligates a person for shmirah. So the ultimate picture is that you are talking about a system called hezek. And the fundamental question that you have to ask about that system, which is composed of four elements, you see, it's composed of damager, damagee, type of damage, and the type of movement. These 4 come together to talk about a certain event called damage. And what ties you to the event? What main concept ties you to the event so that you become obligated? Well, you know what ties you to the event? Shmirah. In other words, the Torah says only if these 4 come together and they all allow you to be able to control the event, then you are obligated to pay. So the fundamental concept in the whole structure is the element of shmirah. When are you chayav? When you are able to watch something. And if it turns out that you are not able to watch something, because one of these elements is missing, so the Torah says, you're patur. Why? Not because there was no damage. You're patur even if there is a damage. But if it was determined that you could not watch any of the 4 elements in the structure of hezek, you are patur. So we see that's the difference when you look at something through its structure and you look at something through its details. When you see the details, you see everything is separate and you don't realize what the event is. Because fundamentally, Hezek is an event. It's something which happens. A damage occurs. But a damage to who? A damage to someone who's critically damaged. And it happens in a certain way. You see it. And it happens because the structure of a damager is composed of the physical aspect of it, like a shore or ace, the physical body of that which damages you, but it's also composed of an aspect of motion. It's composed of a movement in some sort, where something has to bring the damager to the damagee. It's like a shidduch, if you want to say. That every hezek is structured like a shidduch. There's a man and there's a woman. And somehow this man finds this woman attractive and he says, I want to be with you. So therefore, the relationship between a man and woman is really like a picture. It's not about the man. It's not about the woman. You see it? It's not even about their relationship. It's about all three of these aspects. The definition of a marriage is a union between a man, two, a woman, and then it's a certain union where they live life together. So the definition of a marriage is composed of three elements that form the structure in the marriage. So therefore, when you want to know the halachas of a marriage, you want to know all three. Who can be a husband? Who can be a wife? And what are you allowed to do in marriage and what are you not allowed to do? It's composed of these three aspects of a marriage. The same thing with damage. Damage is an event. It's not the damager. It's not fire. It's not an ox. It's not a boar. It's not a pit. It's not. The concept of damage as a picture is not a concept about who is damaged, nor is it a concept of how much is damaged. It's not about how the damage itself occurs. These are only details of the damage event. But what you're looking at is the holistic, you're looking at the entire event called damage and all the fundamental details as they come together to form a damage event. And that's how it has to be looked at. When you learn a chokhmah, when you learn something, you're not learning the detail of something. You're learning about an event. And many times an event is composed of separate items all merged together in one event. So therefore, if you want to know the event, you have to know all the details that are merged in a specific event. And that takes work. It's not easy. Because you have to think in two different directions. You have to think downward in terms of the details of an event. But then you also have to think upwards when all the details come together and create a holistic event. And the event is a combination of all four of these details. You have to see it from two ways, going up or seeing the totality of the event and going down to see what the event is composed of. What are the details of the event? And if you don't see something in these two aspects, you are missing a tremendous amount of the event. And you cannot begin to understand the ultimate, to explain the event. Why does the event happen? You will have no understanding of why an event happens when you have no understanding of what the event looks like as a total event composed of its details. And when the event is composed of specific details, it's only when you have the knowledge of all of these details as they form the entire event where suddenly it begins to make sense. So this is the Mishnah. We've just translated most of the Mishnah in terms of what it talks about. So the Mishnah, therefore, talks about specific damages. But it's really talking about the structure of a damager. It's telling us that a damager, some are alive, some are not. It's talking about the physical body which damages. But what it's talking about is also the concept of the movement, what connects the damager to the damagee. And that's a very critical thing. So that's what the Mishnah is saying. I would think that the concept of movement only obligates a person in certain areas, but not others. So a person is obligated if the damager goes to the damagee, but I am not obligated if the damagee goes to the damager. Why, why would I think that I can watch this thing? But the Mishnah says, no, you can watch it. Why? Because if you cover the ball, if you cover the ball so that nobody can fall in, that's considered watching. So even though you don't control where the nizik goes, you are still pata because you are controlling it. So therefore, I want to point out that this Mishnah, you could see from a holistic point, what you're really studying is an event, and you have to see it as a total event and all the details of that event. So this is the idea which is critical, and we will find in all Mishnahs the combination. So that in the end, you have to ask yourself one question. Every time you learn a Mishnah, you have to ask one question. And the question is what? The question is, what is the theme of the Mishnah? Every Mishnah talks about certain laws. But every Mishnah, in a sense, has a certain title. That's right. It talks about a certain amount of laws. And you have to ask yourself, well, what's the title of each Mishnah? And if you can't tell me the title of each Mishnah, the one idea which represents the whole Mishnah, you don't know the Mishnah. And next time, what I'm going to talk about, how do I determine the title of a Mishnah? Because that's the most important thing. That tells us what the Mishnah is about. And it combines every aspect of the Mishnah in that title. So what we want to know is, how do we title a Mishnah? Well, that's for next time. Thank you for sharing and so on, and I hope you benefited from it.